human defenders of the living city work alongside their Sylvaneth spirit allies to defend their haven. In this video, we'll be showing you how to paint the uniform and heraldry of the human troops of the living city. All the paints you'll need for this guide are on screen now. But remember, these are just our suggestions and you can paint your miniatures however you like. Also on screen now is any additional equipment we've used. This includes brushes and mediums. However, please feel free to use whatever brushes you're most comfortable with, and if you don't have mediums at home, you could use water instead. To demonstrate these painting techniques, we've got a free Guild steel helm undercoated in grey cere. This undercoat is a great mid-tone, which will be easy to layer over with both darker and lighter colours. So we're going to start off by painting that shield, and the first thing we're going to do is base coat the wood using Lauren Forest. Now, even though this is a layer paint, we can still use this to base coat with. We might just need an extra layer or two. With all layer paints, it's always a good idea to thin our paint down. So we add it to our palette and add a touch of water to it. This will thin it down and make it much smoother. Then we apply it to the miniature in several thin layers. Doing this avoids clogging up any of that awesome detail we can see. You don't need to worry about being neat here. Just make sure you get that paint into all those tricky areas, and don't forget to paint the back of the shield too. Next, we'll be adding a shade over that wood, and for this we'll be using a Thonian camo shade. This is a really nice dark green, so it will add plenty of depth to those recesses. When we're applying this, we want to apply it heavily and neatly, taking care to control any excess pooling. If you find the pool is shading too much in any of the recesses, clean off your brush and use that to soak up any excess. It's quite easy for shades to run out of control on a miniature, so we do need to keep an eye on this. With that shade dry, we're then going to add a dry brush all over the wood, and for this we're going to use Nurgling Green. We add the dry brush now so that we don't need to worry about being neat. We'll be painting all the other details later anyway. Here we're going to use a small dry brush, as this will help us get into all those tricky to reach areas. When you're dry brushing, it's best to add a little bit of the paint onto a paper towel or a piece of cardboard. Then work off most of the paint. We want to make sure that there's only a small amount of paint left on the bristles, so we can work this off onto the surface using crisscross and circular motions. When we're happy with the amount of paint left on the brush, we can then take this onto the miniature. Doing this creates a really subtle highlight. We'll move the brush in backwards and forwards and circular motions, and you'll see that this just catches all that raised detail and adds that highlight. You might want to dry brush more heavily towards the bottom of the shield, as this will make it look much more worn and like it's seen some real battle. The next thing we'll do is paint the centre of the shield, and for this we're going to use Ironrack Skin. Now again, this is a base paint, so we need to thin it down with some water and apply a few thin layers. This is really important here, as this is a flat surface, so any texture that we build up could show quite easily. So multiple thin layers is definitely the way to go. By this point, we've already painted some other details, so just take your time and try and be as neat as you can. However, don't worry, you can always tidy up mistakes, you just need to follow the previous steps again. Now we'll be adding a metallic detail, and we'll be painting the trim using Iron Warriors. You might want to use something like a small layer brush here, as this will give us much more control of the paint on these quite tricky and intricate details. Again, thin this paint down and apply a few thin layers, taking care around the details that we've already painted. If we're neater now, this does save us time in the long run, as we don't need to spend so much time tidying up mistakes. Next, we'll add a shade over the middle of the shield, and for this we're going to use Croak Green, but we're going to thin it down with some Lahmian Medium so that it's a little bit more subtle over that pale base coat. For this mix, we'll be using 1 part Lahmian Medium to 1 part Croak Green, but remember, if you haven't got mediums, you could use water instead. You'll see that thinning it down just makes it more subtle and helps the paint to flow more. And as always, when you're applying a shade, just take care to control that pooling. Doing this ensures that we get a consistent finish when the paint dries. Now we're going to add a little bit more to that trim. We're going to thin down Black Templar with Contrast Medium. For this, we'll be using 2 parts Contrast Medium to 1 part Black Templar. And what this will do is just thin it down again so it's more subtle and it doesn't overpower that base coat. Even though Black Templar is a contrast paint, we can still thin it down and use it in just the same way as shades. They're really versatile paints. Now, if you'd like to add an extra step here, you can add an edge highlight of iron hand steel to the trim. For this, we'll want to use a small layer brush, as this will give us the most control. When you're edge highlighting, make sure you've got a really stable painting position, and make sure you keep a good point on your brush. Don't be scared to move the miniature around as much as you need to get the best angle for applying those highlights. Wherever you can, you might find it easier to use the edge of your brush. You can use this along the hard edges on the shield, and this will give you a quick and easy highlight. And this is great if you've got loads of these miniatures to paint. Now, if you'd like to add an edge highlight to the middle of the shield too, you can use Deepkin Flesh. Follow the same steps as before, just being as neat as you can around those details you've already painted. But don't worry, you can always tidy up mistakes. This particular area lends itself really well to using the edge of the brush, as it's quite a raised detail, so move the miniature around as much as you need to get the best angle. We also need to thin our paint down like normal, but we need to make sure that we don't over thin it, as if we do this it could become watery and then it won't settle on the miniature correctly. We're looking for the paint to glide effortlessly off the brush. And with that done, our shield is finished and looking awesome. Now we're going to move on to painting the tunic. So the first thing we're going to do is base coat that tunic, and for this we're going to use Auric Flesh. This is a really nice bright green and it'll work really well with that shield we've already painted. This is quite a thin paint, so it might take 2 or 3 coats to get a full coverage. It's up to you what size brush you prefer to use here. We're using a small base brush, but you might be more comfortable with something like a medium layer brush or even a small layer brush. Once that's fully dry, we can add a shade all over the tunic, and for this, we'll be using Beeltan Green. This is a very vivid shade, and it'll add a really cool effect to our miniature. Apply the shade heavily and neatly, working in small sections. Doing this ensures that the paint doesn't dry too quickly anywhere, and this gives us a better overall finish. If you find that the shade is a little bit strong in places, you can use some Auric Flesh, thin it down and go back over the raised details. And if you'd like to add a highlight to this tunic, you can use Krieg Khaki. Follow the same steps as the previous highlight, just taking your time and being as neat as you can. Pick out all those raised details and the edges as well. Wherever you can, it's good to use the edge of the brush. This will speed things up and make the highlight much sharper. And if you make any mistakes, don't worry. Just thin down some Auric Flesh and layer back over the area. It's up to you how many highlights you want to add here. Just take your time and work your way around the miniature, picking out as many of those edges as you like. And there we have it. The tunic and shield of our Free Guild Steel Helm are complete and looking great. You can apply the techniques shown to any Cities of Sigmar miniatures that you'd like to paint in these colours. We've applied a transfer to the shield just to finish it off, and if you'd like to learn more about using transfers, we've got a video all about them. For more tutorials, tips and tricks, you can head to your local Warhammer store where our amazing staff will be more than happy to help. Or head on over to citadelcolour.com. Well, we hope you've enjoyed the video and we'll see you next time. Bye!